about the distinction between your numbers, your Enneagram numbers? Doesn't that really divide us up, Charles, Pete, Caleb?
That's such a six thing to say. I have no idea what it is.
Yeah.
Of a transition here.
You like that?
Like Kevin MC.
That was good.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that in, Kevin. That's good. So, Pete, you had kind of raised this issue as well for us to discuss tonight. So let's dive into that a minute. That other conversation I do believe could go on longer as well. But to cover a couple of different things tonight, the Enneagram. You gave some background when we were talking about bringing this up. Would you be comfortable sharing some of that background, and then I'll go into a little bit of what I've seen as well?
So I recently heard a conversation. It was among some pretty young folks, and somehow personality tests came up. And somebody had mentioned how their church was doing this thing. And the only reason why I know that the name is associated with what they were talking about is because I've heard the two associated before. They didn't specifically say the Enneagram. They specifically were talking about personality tests and a numbered personality test. And they said, for example, my mom is something 7, or anyways. It just simply brought out, hey, there's a type of person and there's a numerical component to it. And honestly, I wanted to be able to approach that, since these young people were talking to some of my children. And I was like, I find myself in this moment woefully uninformed about what it is, but I know enough about that. I'm at this point, I would say I'm really cautious to the point of saying, you know what, it's something I could leave out. But in some of our discussions, Caleb and Kevin and Charles, is that the Enneagram may have some nefarious roots. And if those are exposed, maybe that would change I'm cautious to the point of leaving it out, to the point where I'm not just cautious to the point of leaving it out. I'm actually against it and would inform others of why I'm against it and why I believe they should be as well. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's a good contrast to the earlier subject of Christmas trees or Christmas practices, because in this case we do know a lot about the roots of it, and they're relatively recent. They're in this century, and we know a great deal about where the Enneagram came from, who developed it, how and why, and how it more recently entered into Christian circles. So we can go into details, but it would be a very different conclusion. In this case, the Enneagram undoubtedly has non-Christian, in fact, anti-Christian spiritual roots. And even in its Christian dressing, ultimately it undermines just foundational concepts of the Christian faith. That's the broad answer.
Yeah, just real briefly before we dive into the history a little bit more, I just pulled up a Google page just to show viewers who may be unfamiliar with this. This multi-pointed star is typically what you see with the Enneagram in lots of different way, shapes, and forms. It's billed as a personality test that tells you strengths and weaknesses and how to communicate with people of other types. Just to give some background as to what it is. And it's gained popularity over the last few years, especially within both business and church circles. And I guess now is a good time to dive into the history of it, because it's often touted as something that's comparable to a Myers-Briggs test, and maybe even, or a DISC assessment. and gives those kind of insights to a person is how this is kind of built. And specifically, people like Richard Rohr, who've wrote multiple books on it and kind of got it going into Christian circles. It's billed as being very helpful in terms of recognizing your type. You'll hear people refer to each other as, well, you're a 1 or I'm a 6, and that's why I behave this way. And those kind of statements. So for people unfamiliar with it, hopefully this will at least bring you on the same page as to what we're talking about here. Now that we're going to dive into a little bit of the history on it. And I think there's really 2 angles we can take in looking at it. You can look at it historically, and then the other way to look at it is to take a look from the perspective of psychological reliability. How reliable is this thing as a psychological test for personality?
Yeah, that's a good question.
All right, so
I think I heard, and I was listening to Blog and Mayblog. Thanks, Charles. I was listening to that guy, and one of the things that he said is that a lot of times these personality tests, they can kind of come across as a little bit snake oily. And the things that they tell you about yourself that you already knew are the things that your grandma knew. It's the people who really know you, they're going to not be surprised. But hey, when you come across as a jerk, you come across as a bulldozer, Pete. And the things that you wouldn't agree with as much kind of end up being stuff that's just the snake oil component of it. But then Kevin, Charles, Caleb, tell me if I'm wrong. Does this have a root in astrology and possibly even pagan deities or something like that?
Well, you're talking about 2 different things there. I'll let Kevin dive into the history, but what you're describing from a psychological perspective is what's known as the Barnum Effect. This is what you see in horoscopes and code readings and that sort of thing. It's where you use information that's common to people in general. So, I have days where I procrastinate. Well, pretty much everybody can relate to that. So, yeah. So the Barnum Effect is statements like that really catch some. Oh yeah, I can relate to that. But in general, they are statements that 80-90% of people are going to be able to relate to in some way, shape, or form. It's the same way horoscopes work, and you see a lot of that heavily with the Enneagram.
I would suspect that it's actually a little worse than that, because with a horoscope, it's kind of luck of the draw, right? I mean, I'm a Pisces because I was born in late February, so I don't think that at all has anything to do with my personality as it is, although some of the horoscopes may happen to match up. But with the Enneagram, you're kind of self-matching. They put personality traits, and then they got question and answer to kind of help you self-identify with the set of personality traits you already were. So by the time they say, I mean, it's not this simple, but if there were questions like, do you ever procrastinate? And then you're like, yes. Well, that's because you're a personality that procrastinates. You're like, oh my gosh, it knows me. How does it know me so well? So
you get to pick your number with the Enneagram, unlike in astrology, you're picked, your sign is picked for you, but they are similar. Well, I'll say this. To say that I'm a Christian using the Enneagram would be in important ways analogous to saying I'm a Christian astrologer who casts horoscopes. They're not the same, obviously, but the validity of them spiritually and psychologically is roughly equivalent.
Okay, so let me push back on that a little bit. I'm not a fan, but just to hopefully steelman this, I think we would agree that there are such things as personality traits.
Yes, yeah, I was talking specifically about the Enneagram.
Well, okay, so if the Enneagram tends to identify certain personality traits, then maybe what's different than that between maybe a big five reading or something like that.
A what?
Was it the big five? Isn't that like personality?
Oh,
Big five. Oh, big five sporting goods.
You cut out just a little bit there for me, Charles. Can you repeat that question?
The big five personality test. So
all right. That brings over to Caleb's area more of psychological validity. There are personality tests that have scientific validity to them.
Okay.
So that's a different type of distinction to make.
And when compared to those things, overall, the reliability of the Enneagram is very mixed. In terms of identifying a personality type that fits with somebody, there's a few papers out there on this that show the reliability being somewhere in the moderate range for identifying a personality type. The problem is a lot of these types are mixed within the Enneagram, and the studies that look at just whether somebody identifies with a particular type and how much they stay within that type don't go to the comparisons that people take from it, such as, I may be a 6, but when I'm stressed, I go to an 8 or go to a 3. So the psychological reliability test don't always look for all those factors that people are drawing from it. So even though the reliability and maybe identifying a single type is moderate, it's not nearly in the same kind of reliability range as you would see with something like a DISC communication assessment or with a Myers-Briggs personality test.
Right. So that's kind of what I was getting at, because that's where things just it seems weird to me. So if you were really concerned about something that accurately predicted or described your personality and how your personality associates with another personality, like, wouldn't you want to go to something that was really the most reliable? And if the Enneagram wasn't that, then why are you using it? That's where it's kind of weird. I think that's what we're trying to say. It's like, why are we using this one? Why are we focusing on the Enneagram instead of something that is much more psychologically based?
One word. Well, two. Christian marketing.
Right.
Okay, it's an industry. So the Christian versions of the Enneagram, then, well, even like the originals, are spiritual. So Christian publishers picked up on the fact that if we Christianize this, if we baptize it, we can combine two of the most powerful sales forces, the psychological market and the spirituality market. It's a definite winner. So the Myers-Briggs test, accurate, helpful, scientific, not spiritually marketed or applied generally. It's not the essence of it. Anything can have connection to your spiritual life and should, but my point that the test itself is not spiritualized, whereas the Enneagram is mystical, subjective, malleable, and ultimately reinforces self-centeredness. It's just the thing the American Christian market's going to buy up.
I'm telling you, it's back here again, because what I'm hearing you guys say is that it's basically, in whatever term, it's just fashion. It's a fashion thing. I mean, sales and marketing really is tying into the cultural fashion of the time. And so we're sacrificing the accuracy of the actual personality test, right? So it's not as good for a personality test. It's certainly a sacrifice on the spiritual realm because it's background and some of the things that it implies. So you're missing that one. It's like you're giving in on the accuracy of the personality. You're giving in on the spiritual side, but we do it anyway because it's culturally popular.
Yeah. Has the appeal of both and the
very colorful.
The truth of neither, the appeal of both.
Yeah. Wow.
One of the things, Kevin, that you said, I think that just rings true, is anything that tends to make me focus on myself, that should be something of caution, especially focus on myself for the positive aspects of myself, or to push myself, or to market myself, or make excuses for myself. That self-centeredness, even the most, I would say, even the most accurate, the good personality tests. If you're just sitting there putting your identity in the hands of, I did the DISC model, I was ranked topped out on D&I, driven and inspirational, and there's a tendency to make myself the center, and a tendency to make this my excuse as to why I can or do these things. And in reality, we're being renewed by Christ. So isn't that person, that me, isn't that a person I'm supposed to be putting to death every day?
Right. I mean, any personality test can be used, if it's fairly valid, can be used for some good, by God's grace and the right intentions. We should be self-examining, but not self-obsessed. And that's where it gets tricky with mystical psychology. What the Enneagram is, it makes it slippier than it already is.
Yeah, one thing I found, because I've read a couple of the popular level books marketed to Christians on this topic, because I wanted to know about it from the inside, as I do with most of these. And one of the interesting things to me about it, that was probably the most disturbing aspect, is how it writes off sin very genetically, in terms of, well, you're a 6, so the type of sins you're going to be engaged with are these. You can't help it. It's what your type is. So these are the things, that you're going to do wrong. And it doesn't really, from everything I saw, it doesn't really address improving and cutting those things from your life, and this constant path to growing closer to God that we see within Christianity. That's not encouraged so much as, this is what you are, get used to it.
Yeah.
It's more about self-understanding than self-mortification. Mm-hmm. Susan put up a couple links, but there's another one here too. I just put in our chat, but I know you and I both know Marcia Montenegro, and for folks who want to follow up on a lot more details, since we're past time, maybe we can put that link back up again for our folks.
Yeah, I'll throw that in the description, as well as there's an excellent article by Jay Mendenwalk that covers a lot of the psychological side of this.
Good.
He's a grad student in psych and has covered it as well. So we'll put those in there. But real briefly, I don't want to keep us, we're already over time a little bit, but Kevin, could you give us like the 30-second to 1-minute version of some of the history of the Enneagram and why the history is concerning as well?
Okay, skipping some of the names, they're occultists in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Uspensky and Gurdjieff had occultists who developed this idea of mapping the cosmos itself. So this 9-pointed symbol is representative of their view of the nature of reality as a whole and mankind's place in it. So that's what the Enneagram, originally called the Enneagon, was. So this floated around in occult and New Age circles on through the 40s, and in the 60s with some New Age psychologists who brought this into connection with the idea of personality types. So it was only in the 1960s then that there was this merging of the Enneagram, esoteric map of reality, with psychological personality. So the assignment of personality types to the 9 points on that symbol, completely arbitrary and made up by these New Age psychologists. And this is why it doesn't hold up in, scientific testing very well, as Caleb already discussed, as far as the validity of it. So then that floated around for a while, 60s, 70s, 80s, until the 90s, when our old friend Richard Rohr, which some of you may remember a few episodes ago on Christianity, the guy who was bashing the idea of sin itself, the idea of original sin, same guy, an apostate Catholic priest, New Age guy, he writes a book on the Christianized version of the Enneagram. It appeals to, a New Age spirituality, a market. Then, more recently, Christian publishers decided to cash in on this and further refine it, baptize it. That's the shortest version I can give.
I appreciate that, Kevin. I think that kind of sums up. We were at least able to hit on two major points that people should look into, I think, a little more before giving any credence to this. And particularly if you're seeing it raised within your church, it may be time to do a little research into it and, to hand some of these articles out to people within the church who have enough influence to maybe say, hey, we should probably, look out for this yield sign and make sure we're being careful before we go down this road.
If you're a Christian who believes the Bible, in any sense, really, Richard Rohr disagrees with you deeply on everything important, and he is the sole source of your Christian Enneagram author's information.
And just to be clear, are there names of books or names of the Enneagram? Does it go by the Enneagram, or is it called something else?
It's usually in the subtitle now. So like the big one is The Road Back to You by Stable. And that's a very fitting title, because instead of taking the path to Christ and holiness, our spiritual journey is a call to take the road back to yourself, which would fit with Rohr's idea that the true self is sinless and divine, right?
It's the same flipping sin over and over again.
Wasn't it? Who was it that played the part of Satan where he said, "Pride is my favorite sin"?
Al Pacino.
Yeah, Al Pacino.
The end of Devil's Advocate, right?
Yeah, and it really is. It's the more I can focus on me, and I guess the little nugget I would tack onto the end of this is that there's frequently, very often, I feel like the enemy of our soul does not want to necessarily wholeheartedly take your focus off Jesus and God, particularly not God, but wants to take you off of the focus of the fact that you need a Savior, and therefore you must be repentant and humble before the Savior. You're okay the way you are. Sure, Jesus likes you. God likes you. No, actually, Jesus is standing as a barrier between you and the wrath of God. And you have to be clothed in him. And that's the part that it seems like our enemy wants us to forget.
That's a very good point, Pete. I appreciate you bringing us back to that here.